Tim and Elena, can you guys just nod to see if you can hear me? Okay, great. There we go. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this, the first of a 4-part online teach-in, kind of modeled, as Tim says, as the anti-Vietnam War movement sort of kicked off. And since we are all across the country, I'm zooming in from Hawaii. Elena Kim is zooming in from California, and Tim Shorrock is in Washington, D.C. This is an important opportunity for us to all get connected and to start getting mobilized. That was a segment of Memory of Forgotten War, which is a film by Deanne Bourchier-Leem and Ramsey Leem called Memory of Forgotten War. It's on YouTube. It's a great 12-minute trailer because the whole film was aired on PBS, and you can contact info at Women Cross DMZ to find out how you can get the actual DVD. But it's a great 12-minute trailer that you can use when you organize any kind of teach-in about the Korean War. Today we are kicking off this online teach-in. This is the first of a 4-part series. We wanted to give the peace movement kind of a 101 on the historic conflict and how we have gotten to where we are today. Women Cross DMZ has been part of a national call initiated by Peace Action. And we proposed online teach-ins as a way to get everybody up to speed, as there is so much misinformation about North Korea and why we are even in this crisis to begin with. The next webinar, we are going to do one weekly, is going to cover the economic war against North Korea. Then we're going to hear from peace activists from South Korea and Japan on how the brinkmanship is impacting them and how they are resisting. And we'll close with experts in Washington, D.C. who will give us concrete asks we can make of our Congress and how you can take those asks to make sure that our voices calling for peace and diplomacy are heard. So you should register now because there is limited capacity. I just wanted to quickly thank Jacqueline, who is also on the panelist with us. She's helped us so much with the back end, and it's just fabulous that we're able to use this technology to bring everybody together. Several national and grassroots organizations felt it was important to call for actions the week of November 4th through 11th, which is when President Trump will be in Asia. So we're calling on folks to organize something, whether it's teach-in, whether it's visits to your local members of Congress, and this will culminate in a national actions in key cities organized by Veterans for Peace on November 11th, which is Armistice Day. So let's just quickly get started. I'm so honored to have Elena Kim and Tim Shorrock. These are 2 longtime respected Korea experts to give us an overview of the historic roots of the conflict and how we got to where we are today. Elena Kim is a professor at University of California at Irvine and the author of many books, including one that is just coming out soon about the demilitarized zone. And Tim Shorrock is a veteran journalist. He writes for The Nation and many other outlets, but he has been doggedly reporting about what has been happening and providing urgent analysis so that we can kind of track truly what is happening. Afterwards, we will discuss concrete steps that the peace movement can advocate together to stop war and advance a long-term peace process that ends the 64-year Korean War. Before we begin, though, let me just set the stage with a quote from Secretary of Defense William Perry. He says, "Americans should understand vividly that we are on the brink of war with the regime in North Korea, unlike in 1994, already possesses a nuclear arsenal of perhaps 20 weapons. Tensions, we know, have been mounting ever since January 26th, but Trump poured gasoline on fire when he called the North Korean leader, quote, Rocket Man, and threatened at the UN to totally destroy North Korea. It's a sovereign nation of 25 million people." And 2 days ago, the US B-1 2 US B-1B strategic bombers flew over the Korean Peninsula. This is following a similar flight on September 23rd when the US Air Force flew B-1B bombers and F-15 fighter jets across the northern limit line. That's across the maritime border, which was established to prevent skirmishes. And that illegal crossing prompted the North Korean foreign minister, Ri Yong-ho, to say that since the US, quote, declared war on our country, we will have every right to make countermeasures, including the right to shoot down US strategic bombers, even when they are not inside the airspace border of our country. The USS George Washington, a nuclear aircraft carrier, is now barreling towards Korea, and strategic assets, including a nuclear-powered submarine, has been moved to South Korea. The US is gunning for war. This past June, when asked why Washington wouldn't just go to war with North Korea to prevent it from acquiring the capability to strike, Secretary of Defense James Mattis replied, quote, "It will involve the massive shelling of an ally's capital. It will be a war more serious in terms of human suffering than anything we've seen since 1953. But then the day before Trump's UN speech, when asked if there were any military options that would not endanger Seoul, Mattis said, yes, there are, but I cannot go into details. Then Trump's ominous threat in a photo op with top military officials a few days ago about the calm before the storm has just sent chills throughout everybody and is obviously eliciting fear among all of us. And as if this wasn't frightening enough, Republican Senator Bob Corker, who's the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he warned that Trump is setting us on a path to World War III, and that he wasn't alone in fearing this. And just yesterday, Democratic Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut told Vox that he has, quote, begun to hear whispers of more serious war talk in and near the White House, end quote. So here's a quote from him about how it's important for both Republicans and Democrats to ensure that Trump comes to Congress before he uses any first strike on North Korea. So as Trump starts to unravel, even Chief of Staff Jim Kelly and Jim Mattis have discussed how to physically block Trump should he order a nuclear attack. This is what we're up against. So let's take a deep breath and a deep dive to understand how we arrived here. Elena, please.
Okay, is it visible for everyone? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Hi, everyone. This is Elena Kim from University of California, Irvine, and I'm very happy to be participating in this very important webinar and teach-in around this very critical moment. So I want to thank Christine for bringing us together, and also want to thank Jacqueline for all the tech support and other kinds of background support. So Tim, I think, has a really important store of information to share with us. And I'm just here to provide some information on the background of the Korean War. Many of you may know this history already, but it's always good to sort of have the historical context so that we can all be on the same page. So just to begin, this photo is a picture from Pyongyang in October 1950. And this is even before the nearly 2 years of carpet bombing that the US staged while the armistice was being negotiated. So you can see the devastation, and we heard in the opening clip from Diane Brochet-Lim's film, Memory of Forgotten War, about how brutal the Korean War was. So I think it's just really important to remember how just vital it is to try to avoid another conflict. So this is just a map of the peninsula, and you can see that the 38th parallel does not coincide with the actual border between North and South Korea. And the reason for this is that as the fighting dragged on, much of the negotiation was about where the actual border would lie, whether it would go back to the 30th parallel or if it would go to where the ceasefire line was at the time of the signing. So in the end, it was determined that the border would lie along the ceasefire line, which is the military demarcation line. And the DMZ today is bounded 2 kilometers north and 2 kilometers south of that military demarcation line. So Christine earlier talked about the northern limit line, which is, when it comes to the land area, is 2 kilometers north of the DMZ, and the southern limit line is 2 kilometers south of the DMZ, I'm sorry, of the military demarcation line. When it comes to the northern limit line in the maritime areas, especially on the western coast, that has always been a contested border. It was determined unilaterally by the UN command, which is essentially the US military. And so since the 1950s has always been a source of conflict and contestation. So I just wanted to talk briefly about the armistice agreement itself. I think there's oftentimes confusion over what the document actually is and who signed it. So it was, as the opening of the agreement itself states, it's an agreement between the US and the UN, or the UN command, which is essentially, controlled by the US military, the DPRK and China, and South Korea, which was under the presidency of Syngman Rhee at the time, refused to sign the armistice agreement. And this was because President Rhee was adamant that the Koreas should be united militarily. And so he refused to sign. And that is the part of the reason why any peace treaty would have to take place between the US and North Korea. Okay, so then when it comes to the peace treaty, why is there no peace treaty? The armistice was actually signed with the intention to be closed with the signing of a peace treaty. And in Geneva, there were meetings held a year after the signing, but those talks failed. So what we have today is a very unstable situation where what was essentially an international proxy war was concluded with the signing of a peace treaty, with the signing of an armistice and not a peace treaty. But we also have to remember that the Korean War was a civil war, and that also has not ended. So one of the things that I was reading recently is an article by Stephen Lee. The citation is at the bottom of this slide, The Korean Armistice and the End of Peace. And he talks about a UN resolution in 1975, which was put forward by the non-aligned countries, which demanded that, quote, the real parties of the armistice must replace it with a peace agreement as a measure to ease tension and maintain and consolidate peace in Korea. The resolution would have called for the withdrawal of US troops and the dissolution of the UN command. So this was a resolution that was immediately countered by the US, which really did not want to withdraw troops. South Korea at the time did not want that either. And what unfolded subsequent to that was what's known as the Axe incident at the Joint Security Area, which was another moment in which World War III was very close at hand. The tensions were incredibly high. And I won't go into the details of that particular incident, but it was essentially the violation of the armistice by US troops within the area of the joint security, area. And the North Korean response to that was then led to what were the first massive joint military exercises with the ROK and the US military right alongside the DMZ. And it very much parallels what has been the situation in recent years around the escalation of militarization, the escalation of threats and brinkmanship, and also the painting of North Korea as a hostile and irrational player that should not be negotiated with. So after this incident, the US convinced other members of the UN to scrap the resolution that may have led to an actual peace agreement. Okay, and then the last kind of substantive thing I wanted to talk about is what has been known as what has been called by South Korean intellectual Nak Jung-paek the division system. And this is a system that has been naturalized. It's a system that assumes that North Korea and South Korea have this kind of ongoing antagonism that requires all sorts of state violence to be perpetrated against citizens of their own countries. And it also supports US militarization, South Korean dependence on the US, and ongoing forms of US empire. So the US position on the armistice has always been that it prevents war and creates stability in the region. But history has shown that this is exactly the opposite of what has happened. So both, even though most people would claim that North Korea violates the armistice, both sides have continued to violate it. And one thing I think is that's really important to keep in mind, especially around the ways in which the current rhetoric assumes that any kind of diplomatic contact with North Korea, and also the South Korean strategy towards the North, especially under new President Moon Jae-in, is an appeasement. And I think that that language of appeasement really disregards the ways in which the armistice doesn't work. And the armistice must be replaced with a peace treaty in order to move towards true stability in the region. And the thing that I want to end with is I think a lot of times South Korean views on the situation are either muted, misunderstood, or completely disregarded. And novelist Han Kang recently published an op-ed in the New York Times, and her statement here is something to keep very much at the forefront of our minds. Who is going to suffer the brunt of any military action? It will be the people of both North Korea and South Korea. And South Koreans have been living under the threat of violence, of military conflict, much of it kind of outside the bounds of their own agency and control. So I wanted to underscore this particular statement that she makes. South Koreans understand that any solution that is not peace is meaningless, and that quote unquote victory is just an empty slogan, absurd and impossible. So that is the end of my presentation. And I guess I'll pass it on then to Tim Shorrock.
Thank you, Eleana. That was so amazing. And now, Tim, I'm going to unmute you.
All right, hold on for a second here. Let me get my slides on the screen.
Everybody can see how busy Tim is by his desktop.
Okay, can you see the slide?
We can.
Okay. Okay, I'll start too by saying thank you to the organizers and Christine and Jacqueline for help setting us up. That was a fantastic introduction, Elena. Gave us all an idea of what led to this current situation. Let me just start by saying that I sort of being very active on Korea around the time of that tree incident in 1976. Actually, around then I was just applying to graduate school because I wanted to study about the South Korea I had grown up in during the Cold War, South Korea and Japan. And so I went to graduate school, actually, and that started in 1977 at the University of Oregon, and started focusing very much on South Korea and its economy and how it related to the United States, and started doing a lot of research there. And while I was there at the University of Oregon was when the Gwangju uprising happened in 1980 during a period of martial law, and I went to South Korea a lot in the early 80s. And, basically been writing about it since about 1978. But so my presentation is going to look at how we got here and how we can make the peace and how, a possible deal could be made. And what I'm going to do is talk about the last 23 years, basically, 1994 until today. And I want to start by walking us through the agreement that President Clinton reached with the North Koreans in 1994. And this was, of course, after earlier a crisis at this time when North Korea said it was going to leave the nuclear proliferation agreement and start proceeding to, make plutonium and proceed to a nuclear program. And this almost led Secretary Perry, who Christine talked about earlier, who was Secretary of Defense then. They had plans to actually attack and wipe out this nuclear reactor at Yongbyon that was producing the plutonium. And the only thing that stopped that war was Jimmy Carter going there and meeting with Kim Il-sung. And they basically, reached a rudimentary agreement, Carter and Kim Il-sung. And then after months of negotiation, this agreement came, the Clinton agreement with Kim Jong-il at the time. Again, Kim Il-sung died right after Clinton was there, and then Kim Jong-il was the new leader. So this agreed framework, as it was called, was never approved by the Senate, but it was, Clinton had the power to agree to it. But the most important thing is that, first of all, North Korea did not have the bomb then. It was just working to make a bomb. It only had a very rudimentary missile program at the time as well. Under this agreed framework, North Korea agreed to halt its plutonium-based nuclear weapons program, and it stopped it for 12 years. As Leon Siegel says here, from 91 to 2003, and that was what was seen by the IEA. The inspectors who went in there found that they had actually stopped producing fissile material in 91, and of course they stopped in 2003, and they began again in 2003, which we'll see why in a minute. But the most important thing for North Korea was that the U.S. and North Korea agreed to move forward to full economic and diplomatic relations. In other words, this was a huge breakthrough. And it held long into the Bush years. As you can see here, the State Department was verifying that there was no violations. Colin Powell did in 2002. So both sides were pretty much keeping to it. But there was a big problem. It was signed in October 94. A month later, the Republicans took over Congress for the first time since the 40s, led by very right-wing Congressman Newt Gingrich. And the first thing they did was attack this agreement. And even in fact, before the ink was dry, McCain was attacking it as appeasement, which is a word we just heard from Eleana's presentation. So this was under attack from the very, very beginning. And as a result, Congress had the power to, not fund some of the things that were involved, like the oil shipments. In return for stopping its nuclear program, North Korea, the United States agreed to provide North Korea with fuel oil, 500,000 tons of fuel oil a year, and also to build some light water reactors, which were seen as not as proliferation risky. So they began supplying and shipping oil to North Korea, but it was slowed down, and the U.S. dragged its feet on the normalization of economic and political relations. And in a few years, North Korea was complaining bitterly to U.S. Officials who would meet with and others had met with about they didn't think the U.S. was keeping its end of the deal. And at this time, the U.S. intelligence picked up signs that they might be building a uranium capacity, and they're out there maybe buying machinery, but they didn't have a uranium path to the bomb yet. But their U.S. intelligence had picked up some signs of it. One of the important things about the framework was, as a result of the dialogue that was opened, this ongoing dialogue, the Clinton administration was able to launch talks on North Korea's missiles. And North Korea agreed to talk about its missiles. And basically they reached, after months of negotiation, North Korea told the U.S. it was prepared to basically shut down its entire missile program and not deploy them anymore, medium and long-range missiles. And people may remember Secretary of State Albright went to Pyongyang, met with Kim Jong-un, met with Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-il's, I have it wrong here, it was Kim Jong-il at the time, the top general for North Korea, the third highest ranking person in the North Korean government, actually went to the White House down the street here and met with Clinton, if you can imagine that. But unfortunately, you know, the agreement was never signed, partly because the election of 2000 was so complicated. Clinton had to stay here as Bush and Gore hammered it out in the Supreme Court. The agreement was not signed. And then, of course, Bush was elected. And basically what happened, you know, the neocons that came in with Bush were against this agreement from the beginning. And the excuse they used was this intelligence from the late 1990s about this, you know, that North Korea had started a highly enriched uranium program as a second avenue to the bomb. And they sent a State Department, a fairly low-level State Department official to Pyongyang to read them the Riot Act. We have discovered this. You're building a uranium bomb. The agreement is over. The U.S. basically said that they trashed the agreement. The Bush administration, Cheney and John Bolton, the negotiator that went there, was not allowed to negotiate. They said, just given the fact that they're violating the agreement by building a uranium program, and that's it. Don't talk to them about it. North Korea said, truthfully, at the time, they did not have an HEU program, but they said that, you know, they had the right to build one, and they also said they would be willing to negotiate it and talk about it. But they could not, the U.S. side did not have the permission to negotiate. And, you know, later on, as I write in the article that this is based on in The Nation, Condoleezza Rice, who was the Secretary of State and then, you know, National Security Advisor to Bush, said in her memoir that they really blew the opportunity. By making this accusation that didn't quite hold water, they blew the whole agreement, and they missed an opportunity to shut down their program. And of course, you know, Bush called North Korea on the axis of evil, and he dismissed the sunshine policies in South Korea that Kim Dae-jung was following at the time, who was the progressive who was elected president in the 1990s, who started talking to North Korea and developing economic engagement and political engagement with North Korea. And as a result of this move by Bush to terminate the agreement, the North Koreans said, okay, fine. They kicked out the inspectors and began building what would become their first bomb. And in 2006, they had exploded their first nuclear bomb. And that really set out the nuclear crisis that we're in right now. And a lot of people looking back, such as, you know, Lawrence Wilkerson here says, you know, he thinks the North Koreans cheated because we were cheating. It was a mutual cheating. It's not like you'll see in the press a lot that if you watch CNN, they'll say, well, the North Koreans violated it the next day, this kind of thing. It's absolutely not true. It's much more complicated than that. And, you know, you could say that the U.S. violated it first, but, you know, certainly, you know, both sides did violate the spirit of the agreement. But here's the bottom line. You know, when Bush took office, they didn't have a bomb. They hardly had any plutonium. 5 years later, they had enough plutonium for 7 to 9 bombs, and they had already started missile tests. And they were testing nuclear weapons. They felt free to test them. So the Bush administration collapsed this agreement, and that was a disaster. But amazingly, Bush still opened talks with them after their bomb was exploded. 3 weeks later, can you imagine, like if 2 weeks ago Trump had opened negotiations with North Korea after they tested their bomb, he would have been attacked by all kinds of people, including Democrats. So, you know, this was actually, you know, pretty amazing when you look back at it. And this opened another set of talks called the Six-Party Talks, which involved other countries. And those talks continued for some time, aimed at denuclearizing North Korea again. But at this time, in 2007, there was elections in South Korea, and Roh Moo-hyun, who had taken power after Kim Dae-jung, was also a progressive, was succeeded by Lee Myung-bak, who was a real right-winger, and he was against the Sunshine Policy, and he wanted to undermine it from the start. And there was a new conservative government in Japan, and they started making demands that North Korea, in the earlier part of the talks, had not agreed to, about verification. And Bush agreed, to push for those stricter verification language, and that became very problematic. And as I note here, tensions are always lower when progressives are in power in South Korea. This has been historically true because they want to have engagement with North Korea, except for now. I mean, Moon Jae-in came to power hoping to engage, but I think, Trump's, actions and statements since then has made it almost impossible for him to engage. And, we can thank Trump for really increasing the tensions, I think, over the last 6 to 8 months. So North Korea, resisted that demand for closer inspections, and they agreed to some, but they didn't want what the South Koreans and the Japanese were proposing, and so Japan and South Korea cut off any kind of energy assistance to the North, and the talks kind of floundered, and tensions increased militarily between South and North. There was an incident in 2010 when a South Korean warship was sunk. The South Koreans said that it was a North Korean torpedo. That's never been definitively proved. A lot of people see this as sort of the Tonkin Gulf incident of Korea, but it's still very murky exactly what happened. But it really turned the tide as far as increasing military tensions. And Lee Myung-bak was, succeeded by Park Geun-hye, the president who was just impeached. And tensions got even worse under her. And as they worsened, and they exploded more missiles, tested more missiles, and tested more nuclear weapons, she finally closed the Kaesong Industrial Zone, which was the last remnant of the sunshine policies of Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun. And this was about 2 years ago. At this Kaesong Industrial Zone, South Korean companies invested in North Korean workers produce goods for the world market. And it brought foreign currency and technology into North Korea. And it was a very important part of the sunshine policies and the engagement policies. And unfortunately, under Obama, things just got worse, despite his promise when he was running that he was going to, talk to North Korea and Iran. And he and his advisors decided to use the suspension of aid as pressure to force North Korea to accept these verification plans that North Korea rejected. But Obama also rejected the idea of direct talks, and they never did engage in direct talks. A couple of times he sent missions, and that included people from the CIA, to go just make some contact with the North Korean government in Pyongyang, but they never had any negotiations. The six-party talks never were completed. And so as Lee Siegel, who I talked to for this one article, who's been writing about this for many years and has been involved many years, basically said Obama's policy became pure pressure without negotiations. And they also had this idea that North Korea was just basically going to collapse someday, so they didn't really have to pay that much attention to it. So they said, we're going to have strategic patience and, wait for them to implode. But also, the U.S. began to take some very aggressive steps on the cyber war front. All this was leaked to David Sanger at the New York Times over a period of years. But, they got into North Korea's systems. They tried to screw up their missile tests, and they may have succeeded. And they got into their, internet system and were hacking long before North Korea was hacking, Sony allegedly. But, these were steps of war. Cyber war is war. And, this really increased the tensions. And, there were more tests. And another incident in 2010 when some islands were shelled by North Korea. South Korea fired back. There was some very tense days there. War was averted, but tensions still remain high. And so one of the things that Obama really built up was these joint military exercises they were doing with South Korea. And they increased, as I say here, in size and tempo. And that's really, one of the big issues between the U.S. and North Korea now is that the North Koreans see these exercises as very dangerous. And of course, Trump just, threw fuel on the fire by threatening to totally destroy them. As I was saying before we began, when Bush invaded Iraq, Bush never spoke about annihilating the entire North Korean people. He never talked about annihilating the Iraqi people. And now Trump is talking about annihilating an entire country. Not only Trump, but Mattis and his UN ambassador, Haley. And this is really extremist, dangerous language. And of course, it frightens the hell out of North Korea. And just from that segment of the New York Times article from Hong Kong that was just read, it frightens South Koreans. This is a kind of psychological warfare that's extremely, extremely dangerous and driving the situation to just a terrible place. Now, we're at this point now where, you've seen the tests, you've seen the nuclear tests. They're closer than ever to have an ICBM that can actually carry nuclear weapons. And they can do terrible harm to U.S. forces, U.S. citizens, South Korea, Japan during a war. If there is a war, Trump makes a preemptive attack, they're going to fire back. And they have the capacity to do an incredible amount of damage. And as Christine was talking about, she showed the pictures of the B-1 bombers. They're called swans of death. And if you look at them, it's a good term. They've flown north of this sea border. And that's seen as an extremely provocative act by the North Koreans, as it has not happened since the Korean War. And the U.S. is bringing in, they call these strategic assets, these kinds of bombers. South Korea has asked the U.S. to bring more in, the South Korean government, current government, and the military. So I just want to look for a minute at the Kim regime. When Kim Jong-il, who negotiated the agreed framework, was president, he was basically using nuclear weapons and missiles as a bargaining chip because he wanted to normalize relations with the U.S. and also break out of North Korea's post-Cold War isolation. Soviet Union had collapsed. Eastern Europe, its natural market had collapsed. It no longer received low-priced oil from the Soviet Union, and so he was really worried about North Korea being completely isolated economically, and saw this as a way to sort of break through. And he also traveled, went to China and saw China's economic development, and he went to Russia as well. So that was his sort of perspective on the nuclear weapons. Kim Jong-un, his son, has this line called Byungjin line, which basically is that the nuclear and missile development are key to their future, their economic future. I sort of compare it to how the U.S. military-industrial complex was, it came together after World War II. It's like, our military program helped fuel the U.S. economy. And that's basically, I think, how Kim Jong-un sees his, military-industrial economy itself. The building of these rockets, the building of nuclear weapons, everything that goes along with it. It's a very, high-tech operation. But he sees that as the way to move forward, bring North Korea forward. He wants to be recognized as an atomic power and negotiate a peace treaty from a place of strength. And he has yet to really travel, except, as a kid, he studied in Switzerland, but he hasn't met many foreign leaders, and he has very bad relations with China. He has not met Xi Jinping, the leader of China, and and they basically dismissed, meeting with China. They haven't done it. But his foreign minister, Lee Young-ho, and his deputy foreign minister, whose first name I forget, but her last name is Joe, they've been meeting with U.S. Negotiators for many years. Lee Young-ho is very respected by U.S. negotiators that I've met, U.S. intelligence, former U.S. intelligence who have dealt with him, say he's, really a decent guy as a negotiating partner, and they respect him, and they respect their skills of the foreign ministry. And there's a lot of continuity in that foreign ministry. Just because Kim Jong-un has taken over from his father doesn't mean that there isn't continuity in parts of their government. So, they look at these military exercises, they see them as a serious threat to their survival. As you've probably been learning in some of the, media reports, these exercises include decapitation strikes. It's basically assassination squads to take out the North Korean leadership. In the last big military exercises the U.S. held, they sent in SEAL Team 6, the U.S. famous SEAL Team 6 that assassinated Osama bin Laden to do maneuvers in South Korea. You can imagine what kind of signal that sent to North Korea. They fear nuclear attack. They don't want to negotiate away their weapons, and they say they will only negotiate when the U.S. changes its hostile policy and ends its nuclear threats and the sanctions. South Korea, Moon Jae-in, won on this, on the basis of this candlelight revolution that threw Park Geun-hye out. When I saw him in speeches when I was in South Korea over the spring, running for president, he talked about wanting a return to the sunshine policy. He held up pictures of Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun. He was following in their footsteps. And he made a big issue by saying, he wanted to have diplomacy with North Korea and bring back economic cooperation and those kind of ways to defuse tensions. And with that, he has the support of South Korean people on that. Unfortunately, North Korea hasn't responded to his overtures. He asked for, a few months ago, he asked for military talks and Red Cross talks. And North Korea says, he has no independence because of the role of the U.S. military in his country. And as tensions have escalated, Moon and his military have supported Trump's hardline policies and statements. I was myself pretty shocked after Trump gave his speech at the UN talking about totally destroying North Korea. And the next day, Moon complimented on his speech. I mean, I thought that was kind of outrageous. But, he seems to want that kind of hard military support and have these threats made against North Korea. Moon, however, continues to say a war is unthinkable, and he has warned the U.S. about taking unilateral action. There's been some real tension between the U.S. and South Korea over some of these exercises, these B-1 bombers and so on. He's worried that the U.S. could do an attack from outside of Korean airspace and without consulting South Korea, and he's demanded that South Korea be included in any decision like that. As Christine said, this so-called military option, it's really emerged in the last few months. And that letter from that Connecticut senator, that interview with that Connecticut senator just underscores this. And I've been saying this for weeks. They're really talking about this military option. And yesterday, Trump talked about it even more and basically said that that's what he favors. And there's disagreements, but he's the guy that makes the decision, and that's the way it's supposed to work, right? McMaster, his national security advisor, has been pushing for preventive war, which means preemptive strikes. And they seem to think that China will basically help topple the North Korean government and, push them to disarm and even cooperate in a regime change that would put South Korea in charge, which I think is insane. Because the Chinese do not want to have U.S. troops on their border. I think this mistaken faith that China somehow is going to be able to do it for them is really ridiculous and not going to happen. And that's why a lot of former U.S. intelligence people and diplomats say that direct talks are the only solution, and that it's possible that the U.S. may have to recognize them as a nuclear power. So how do we move the situation and make the peace? Well, there's this proposal that's been out there for some time called Freeze for Freeze, as a way to get talks going, in which North Korea would, halt its testing, and the U.S. and South Korea would either stop or really scale down these joint military exercises. I think this is what Moon Jae-in would really like to have. His advisor, has been making speeches about this, but every time he does, he gets shot down by conservatives, and then Moon says he wasn't speaking for Moon, he was speaking for himself. But I think this is basically what the South Koreans would like to have, but it's been rejected by the U.S. And so, what I think we have to think about, what carrots can we offer to get talks going? THAAD is a huge issue, both for North Korea and China. The South Korean peace movement wants THAAD withdrawn. But I think that the key is to start focusing on what it would mean to end the U.S. hostile policy, because that's what North Korea says. That's the only way it'll change its negotiating position, is if the U.S. stops its hostile policy. So what would that involve? Relaxation of sanctions, I think, is pretty clear, but they're really tightening now. And also, offering to talk to them about a peace agreement to end the Korean War. And I just want to go over some points here, just sort of what we're sitting with now at the situation. First of all, we have Abe in Japan, who's the guy who's talking to Trump all the time about Korea, much more than Moon Jae-in. The first guy Trump talks to during any crisis, foreign leader he talks to, was Abe, who's super right-wing, who wants to build up Japan's military, who wants to abolish Japan's peace constitution so Japan can be an independent military player like it was before and during and before World War II. And, it's part of what's now a de facto three-way military alliance between the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. I think that North Korea is unlikely to give up their nukes and their ICBMs, but they do want this peace agreement. And, that's where I think there's, that's probably the only way an agreement can be shaped, because I think we're in a situation now where they're just not going to give up their nuclear program and their ICBMs. I think they've made that pretty clear. We might be able to limit them. They might agree to limit them and take steps to slow their program once and there could be arms agreements like there was during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, but they would have to be recognized more or less as a nuclear power. And if you read the New York Times, Nicholas Kristof today, he makes it very clear that, the real wild card here is Trump. And like I say here, he's a warmonger. He's a militaristic imperialist. And he sees war as a way to expand his own power and expand what he considers, U.S. global hegemony. And so there may be, the only way we can get any kind of movement on this, I think, maybe outside intervention from the UN, China, Russia. Jimmy Carter is talking about in the last couple of days going back to North Korea and meeting Kim Jong-un. And Angela Merkel has made some remarks about how Germany might be willing, but somebody has to jumpstart negotiations. And as far as the next moves, we can discuss, specific steps, but I think it's really important at this time, and it was very important during Vietnam, to build alliances with the South Korean movement, peace, labor, and democratic movement. In stopping the war in Vietnam, it was links between U.S. and Vietnamese activists, between U.S. and Japanese, U.S. and activists all over the world that helped stop the Vietnam War. And I think this kind of solidarity is necessary in this situation. We've got to expand relationships with South Korea, invite them there, and have people from here go there. And it's really important to remember, this is their country. We don't have a right to tell North Korea what to do, or South Korea, or anybody. Korea was divided against their will, against its will. They have a right to reconcile and unify however they want. And I think our job is to help give them the conditions that they can do that and move toward peace. And so that's why I think the need for a peace treaty is very strong, and to set the stage for intra-Korean talks and exchanges that can go whatever direction, to get the peace so North and South can start reducing the tensions between themselves and start integrating like they want to do. It's very important to, I think, to counter the U.S. propaganda. The media just repeats what the Pentagon says with almost no thought, just spills it right out to you. Whatever they say goes into the media. You can see this every night on NBC News. And there's so many lies talked about this history that I just talked about. And, they, like I said earlier, they always say the U.S. violated, North Korea violated it the minute it was signed, and, you can never trust them. But it should, obviously this history shows that there can be agreements made and both sides can keep them. I didn't mention their missile moratorium, but they had a moratorium on their missiles from the late 1990s when they reached that preliminary agreement with Clinton all the way until 2007 when they started firing them again. So, they will agree under the right conditions. And I think I just want to underscore that, we have to fight for peace. Another Korean War is a catastrophe. It just cannot happen. We have to do everything in our power to stop this from happening and inflicting that kind of damage on Korea again. I probably grew up in South Korea in the aftermath of the Korean War, and believe me, we never want to see a war like that again.
Thank you so much, Tim. I'm going to just quickly, we have about 15 minutes to respond to some questions. I think the first one is from Naja Abdul. So with the current situation with North Korea, would the idea of negotiations be a rational choice, or are we as a country too deep in the mess we attributed to? How about I give that to Tim, and in the meantime, Tim, I'm going to upload just a slide about what folks could do right away. So do you mind taking that, Tim?
No. I think I said that I think the U.S. is perfectly capable of negotiating with them. I think if the U.S. made the right offer to North Korea, they would talk with Tillerson and the Trump administration. But the situation we're in now, where people are questioning the, mainstream people are questioning the sanity of our president, and where it's not clear, who is making these decisions in the White House. I think the time might be for an outside person to come in. I'm not sure if Jimmy Carter is the right person, but someone with credibility in the world stage. I think whether it's the UN or China or Russia, but it cannot be a country like China seen as like, okay, North Korea, you do this and this and this, and you basically follow our direction. China can perhaps help get talks going between the U.S. and North Korea to end this tension, but there's got to be direct talks. And I think, yes, the North Koreans would talk to whoever was offered by the U.S. I mean, they've been meeting for years with various ex-officials, and these are meetings called Track 2 meetings, where former U.S. intelligence officers and diplomats who negotiated with North Korea at some point have been meeting with them on a kind of regular basis. Every few months, they'll meet in Europe or New York, sometimes even Pyongyang, and just have discussions. So, the North Koreans would be willing to negotiate directly with the U.S., I believe.
Okay, so I'm just going to quickly, so Elena talked about the need for a peace treaty. I think it's going to be really important for our peace movement to really push that forward as a long-term solution. And Tim talked about the freeze for freeze as a concrete ask and demand. We need to do it through op-eds, through every opportunity when we meet with members of Congress. But here are some concrete asks that one is, we're all calling for some kind of action the week of November 4th through the 11th, which is timed with Trump's visit to Asia. So I can post Will Griffin of the Veterans for Peace. He's agreed to consolidate all the actions that will take place across the country. For example, in Hawaii, on Oahu, a coalition of faith-based academics and community members will go to meet with all of our Senate and House officials that week. And we are also, there's a big protest that's planned on the 4th of November and a teach-in at the University of Hawaii. So whether it's small or large, I think all of us kind of taking action now is going to be really key. So there is a piece of legislation that has been introduced by John Conyers. He's one of 2 Korean War veterans still in the House of Representatives. And it's called the No Unconstitutional Strike on North Korea Act. And we need more co-sponsors. They just introduced this legislation. It basically reaffirms Congress's constitutional power over a first strike on North Korea, that Trump has to come to Congress to have authorization to use military force. And that piece of legislation also adds an additional safeguard so that basically if he does that without coming to Congress, that they would block funds for him to conduct that first strike. So that's a really important thing. If everybody, there's like 100 people on this call, and I don't know how many are joining on Facebook, and then once we share this on YouTube tomorrow, we need everybody to contact their house. I mean, Congress is going to be the only check against Trump right now, besides his so-called, the good generals surrounding him in his cabinet. And I think it's also important for us to actually contact on the Senate side. So we know that Chris Murphy has sounded the alarm about Trump and the White House war on North Korea. I think it's important for us to call these 2 key senators, Bob Corker and Chris Murphy, and let them know that we greatly appreciate their courage, their patriotism, and their ability to take on Trump in this very dangerous moment. So I wanted to just quickly share that. And now I'm gonna, and we're gonna make all of these available. So let me just go on now to the next Q&A, which there are lots. So the next question is from Diana Yu. Could you please explain why the notion of peace negotiations would be a naive concept for some right-wing South Koreans? Let's see, who wants to answer that?
Well, I mean, we have to remember that, before the Sunshine Policy was inaugurated, that, the relations between North and South Korea were very much along the Cold War lines. And, South Koreans were educated to, just as North Koreans are, that North Korea was the enemy, that communism was a real threat. And, but even after the Sunshine Policy, there are many right-wingers, neocons in South Korea who felt like the policy itself was a failure because it, again, following the lines of this discourse of appeasement, was giving too much to North Korea, that they couldn't be trusted. And also because the historic summit in 2000, which led to Kim Dae-jung's winning the Nobel Peace Prize, eventually, was kind of sullied by the fact that that money had changed hands. And so there's a lot of attempts to discredit the gains that had been made. And, these are also people who, may have experienced the war or had, various kinds of traumas associated with the division and the war, and, had been fully inculcated by the propaganda of anti-communism.
Great, thanks for that, Elena. So next question is from Satoko Norimatsu. The question is, what is keeping Moon from being more assertive to Trump? Tim?
I wish I knew. I think that, it's important to recognize the really difficult situation he is. I mean, you have a U.S. military that is extremely powerful in South Korea. A U.S. general heads up the Korean military in times of war. It's a joint command. The U.S. has the most power in it. The U.S. can launch a unilateral strike at any time that could, rend great destruction to North Korea. And Trump is, out of his mind, basically. I mean, how do you deal with a situation like that? And I think that, he's had to stand up a couple times. Like, for example, when there were reports that seemed pretty credible, that were broadcast on NBC, for example, in August, that the U.S. was planning a preemptive strike of B-1 bombers flying out of Guam to launch missiles from outside of Korean waters that would destroy something like 3 dozen North Korean missile sites. Within hours of that report, Moon Jae-in's national security advisor was on the phone with H.R. McMaster, Trump's national security advisor, saying, basically, I think the conversation was, don't you dare try a unilateral strike without without talking to us. South Korea must be involved in any kind of military decision. So I think there's a lot of sort of behind the scenes stuff that we never see. And, publicly, Moon has to show this face of, being very, cooperative with Trump and, appreciating what he says. But I think, and he knows, Moon knows what his power base is, and his power base, people that really support him in South Korea are really upset about the way things have gone with Trump and North Korea and the tensions, escalating tensions. It's also important to recognize that, he was elected in May, he took power, within 12 hours of his election was confirmed. So there was no transition. And so his, as Christine well knows, his national security apparatus, stayed the same from Park Geun-hye. And their decisions that they made back during those days, they made again, like they banned Christine for a few days until, someone talked to Moon and they reversed the decision. So he has this big intelligence apparatus that's been very deeply involved in South Korean politics and trying to, change, use social media to attack, progressives and support the government. And also, his defense, he appointed a new defense chief, but he's got his military that's very much, it's just, the same people that were running it before, and that military there is very powerful. And so he's got a lot of interest, to deal with. So I think that sort of explains, I can't answer for him or explain some of what he says, but I think it's important for us to appreciate the context in which he's operating.
Okay, I'm just going to quickly go through some of these questions. So one is from Jiwon Yu Lee. Can you explain more, specify what exactly Trump wants from the extreme confrontation, avoiding any diplomatic options? What are some calculated gains on the U.S. side? I think, Tim responded to that. He wants to, obviously, he's an empire guy and he wants to have aggressive confrontation. It's also a great distraction from Russiagate and all the other problems that he's facing domestically. And we know that even starting with the Obama administration, that the US had plans towards a pivot to Asia. They see China as a threat to its hegemonic power in the region and globally, and maintaining a US military presence on the Korean Peninsula, I think, advances US military and economic interests. I think we need to counter that to say that 64 years is enough, and peace and another future is possible. The next question is from David Gibson. If Madison Tillerson are the diplomacy guys, how do we counter the influence of McMaster, who seems is the preemptive war guy? I don't know. I mean, I've visited with the National Security Council. I am not completely convinced that we have any pressure towards the White House, but maybe Tim could respond. I think that we need to be, the most important check to a dangerous Trump is actually Congress in this moment. But Tim or Elena, do you have a response to that?
I would just say that even some of the most, right-wing analysts I hear in Washington say that engagement is necessary. People that really know North Korea and say all these things about, they analyze very deeply the North Korean leadership and how they want to preserve their regime and at all costs and so on. They still say you have to engage them, and so I think Mattis and Tillerson sort of understand that, but how to push the process. I think Christine's right that Congress is really critical in this area. I mean, when you have people like that senator from Corker from Tennessee saying Trump is leading us into World War III, I don't think he's speaking for himself only. And I think there's a lot of concern that, even going back to the right-wing analysts, they all say these, Trump's tweets, the things he says, the extreme nature of his comments do so much harm, and they look at it from the point of view of, damaging U.S. interests. So they say, well, Kim Jong-un, his claim is that the U.S. is out to, destroy the regime. So all he has to do is point to Trump's statements, and that's all the proof he needs. So it just completely endorses the way Kim Jong-un, basically rules and his policies, and it underscores everything he says. And the fears that North Koreans have had for 2 generations now that the U.S. is out to get them. So, even conservatives see that as really, damaging the possibility even of any kind of negotiation settlement. So, but in terms of power, I just learned the other day from this article in whatever it was that, under the 25th Amendment, a majority of the cabinet can decide Trump is, a president is unfit to rule. I didn't know the cabinet could do that. But aside from that, I think it's going to take, really strong pressure from Congress. And the fact that Markey has been, even though Markey, some of his policies kind of suck, I think, but at least he's out there speaking against a war. And, Democrats that are saying that, I think that's really important to focus on.
Yep. So we have just one more minute, and I'm sorry that there's so many great questions. I'm just going to quickly summarize them, and maybe in your closing remarks, maybe we'll just go 3 minutes over if anybody has a desire to respond. But I love this question. This is from Tay Lim, who's one of our volunteers. It's not the first time we have a crisis with North Korea, the 1994 with Kim Dae-jung. They made a consensus with the former President Jimmy Carter, then suggested that President Carter can visit North Korea. And as Tim covered in his talk, I was wondering if something similar would also work this time, and saw that President Carter said he's willing to visit North Korea. So that's one question about that. Another is from Charles Carletta, what are the current checks on unilateral action by Trump in Korea? Yes, Enforcement of War Powers Act is definitely relevant in this moment. And Gary Hauser asked, the truth about massive civilian casualties during the Korean War has been suppressed and never communicated. North Korea anger does not exist in a vacuum. It's their strong need for a media campaign to get stories. Absolutely, Gary. He's producing a documentary. So if Gary maybe wants to post your email address on this list, people could reach out to you. So those are the questions, and maybe just really quickly responses from Elena and Tim, or anything you want to say before we wrap up.
I don't really have anything to add except to say that I think, these actions that Christine has outlined are super important right now. I think there's a lot of bad information. There's a lot of propaganda. There's a lot of warmongering talk, and the more that people can just get their basic questions answered and start to piece together what this history is, you know, how we've gotten to this point, and then to express their real outrage and opposition to anything remotely along the lines that Trump has hinted at.
Great, thanks, Elena. And Tim.
I mean, I agree with all that. Deep down, I just can't believe that the U.S. would launch an attack on North Korea. I mean, I see the signs, but I think that there's enough people in the military that know, you know, what a terrible war would be unleashed by even one of these so-called, you know, preventive strikes. And I think there is a pretty strong opposition, you know, within the ranks of the military, you know, to doing this, because, you know, I mean, a war in Korea would be a world war. It would be a major, huge thing. And I think that, you know, just from their perspective, it's a dangerous situation, because it can involve them. They can't anticipate what will happen. You know, it just spirals out of control. And I think that is one big inhibition. But I do think that it's so important for us to remain in touch with South Korea and listen to our South Korean, you know, colleagues, you know, about what we can do to support them, and, you know, push our government in a way that'll help, you know, their government respond, and to really pay attention to, you know, what is being said on the Korean side, and try to, you know, in whatever way you can. I think that the polls are showing that a majority of Americans are very fearful that Trump is leading us into a war in Korea. And I think that shows to me that despite this huge onslaught of propaganda on CNN, on Fox, even on NBC, it's just unbelievable that people don't want to have a war. And I think that you know, that Americans are wise enough to see how Trump is manipulating the situation, and that's what. And, you know, and I think, you know, you talk to a lot of people in intelligence in the military, and they know that also. And so that's my hope, you know, is that, and so, you know, educating people is really important at this stage. It's very, very important to counter the propaganda. That's because I think people are open to it, because they know that they haven't been getting the right information. And so just, you know, telling the truth, you know, countering what you see on, you know, CNN and even in the newspapers is really important. And seeing it from a human side, the humanity of North and South Koreans wanting to have peace, that's what we need to communicate, I think.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Tim and Elena and Jacqueline and all of you for joining. Over 400 people joined us via Facebook Live and over 100 on the Zoom webinar. We advertised this 2 days ago. It's really extraordinary. The next week is on economic sanctions. It's been a primary policy tool that the Trump administration and Obama have used to further isolate North Korea. I think we need to know the real truth and the analysis. And so we have some amazing speakers. And so please keep educating yourselves. Please organize something on the week of November 4th through the 11th. If you have any questions, please email us at info@womencrossdmc.org. And we're building this movement. We need everybody, all hands on deck. Let's stop this war. Let's have a peace treaty with North Korea. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.